Hey, today we're going to talk about something a little bit different. Usually I talk about how to play the piano, but today we're going to talk about the piano itself. Specifically, why was it invented? So I've been wanting to do these, a series of videos on the piano and its history and its mechanics for a while. And I thought, why not give it a shot and just see how it goes. So this is the question we're going to address today. It's going to be a little story. Now, right away from the title, you see that the piano was actually invented at some point, obviously. So that means someone actually had to go and fix something. Something was not properly working with the instruments at the time. If you try and go and Google, just try and Google Bach and piano concertos, and you might get some results. You will get some results, but what you'll get are people performing his pieces on piano, but those pieces were originally written for a different instrument called the harpsichord. So Bach actually never wrote any music for the piano, and basically anytime you see a piano piece by Bach today, it's someone who converted the harpsichord piece to a piano piece after Bach died. So at Bach's time, when he was at the height of his career, the pianos were just sort of going or starting their musical career. And I guess the question we're going to try and address today is exactly what made this shift. What made the piano actually replace the instruments that came before it. The main one of which was the harpsichord. So I'm going to start with a little question, and the question is, you have four instruments here. You have a pipe organ, an upright piano, grand piano, and an acoustic guitar. And one of these things is not like the others. And the question is, which is the outlier? Now, you can answer this question in a lot of different ways, but it's obvious that I'm setting you up because I know you want to say the guitar, but then you're saying, okay, I know he's probably setting me up, so it can't be the guitar. And the answer, of course, depends on how do you define not like the others, right? So it depends on how you ask the question. So obviously, the pipe organ, the upright piano, and the grand piano all have keys. And the guitar has these strings that you pluck. So in that sense, the guitar is the one thing that is not like the others. But the sense in which I'm interested today is a different one. You see, the grand piano, the upright piano, and the guitar all produce their music, their sound, by vibrating strings. And I specifically put this picture of the upright piano here on the screen, because if you've never done this, you should go and take a look. If you open an upright piano, you'll see that it actually has many, many different strings inside it. And the strings are really the heart of the sound that the piano makes. The sound doesn't come from the keys. And the same thing is true for a grand piano. If you open the lid and you look inside, you see many, many strings running across the body of the piano. And obviously the guitar makes its sound by vibrating strings, right? When you play a guitar, you pluck a string. And the organ, the pipe organ, is the only thing that creates its sound, not by moving a string, but by pushing air through pipes. So the pipe organ is really a wind instrument. So it's very different in its underlying physics from a piano, even though the keyboard is the same. Now, I'm not sure if this is a testament to the limited scope or to the wide scope of human imagination, that I think before the invention of electricity and electronic instruments, basically there were really only two ways, more or less, or two main ways of building an instrument, making a sound. So one type of instrument is the stringed instrument, where you create a sound by vibrating a string, and the other type is a wind instrument. So, what's one wind instrument that you're not only familiar with, but you actually have on you at this moment? The answer is your mouth, right? Because when you whistle, you're pushing air through a cavity, which is your oral cavity, your mouth, and you can control the pitch of the sound by changing the shape of the cavity, so by changing the shape of your mouth. And that's how pretty much all wind instruments work. And you know, you have, I mean, there are many examples of wind instruments. A pipe organ is one of them. Obviously, flutes, woodwinds, brass instruments, they all work by pushing air through some sort of cavity. And the shape of the cavity and the holes in the cavity determine the ultimate sound and that you get, and also the pitch of the note. So changing the shape of the cavity or the holes changes the pitch. And the second type of stringed instrument, the second type of instrument are stringed instruments, where you set some string into motion or some object into motion, and the object vibrates the air around it, and as a result produces sound. So the guitar is an obvious example, and the pianos I've just mentioned are stringed instruments. What are some other examples? You know, you have a bass guitar, you have obviously a classical guitar, ukulele. Think about what if you took a string, which is a one-dimensional object, and you stretched it along the other dimension. Well, then you'd get a membrane. So a membrane is really a two-dimensional string. And once you start thinking like that, what kind of membrane instruments do you know? So here's one example you might not think off the top of your head, but a snare drum is a membrane instrument. A snare drum, like a drum that you hit. It has a membrane, and when you hit it with a drumstick, it vibrates. And a snare drum actually has a pitch. It also has a lot of unharmonicity, so it has a lot of things that don't have a pitch, but basically it has a pitch, and a good drummer will actually take the time to tune his snare drum and his toms and bass drum before any recording session. So if you're a drummer, keep this in mind. Please tune your drums before recording, please. And you can think of other types of instruments that fall into these sort of categories. Let's say a xylophone, right? A xylophone is also a membrane instrument. You have a membrane that's made out of, say, wood. You hit it with a mallet, and it vibrates, and it gives off a sound. So those are the two main classes of stringed instruments. Now the piano is a stringed instrument, and it evolved from previous stringed instruments. Now what makes strings so good or so useful for actually building instruments? And the answer is that they can be made to produce very specific pitches. You see, if you take a string and you clamp it on both ends, then it turns out that this string will only vibrate at certain frequencies and will only sustain very specific frequencies. And you can now the lowest most frequency that the string will sustain is called the fundamental, and that's usually the pitch of the string that you hear. So this is a very useful way of constructing pitched instruments. And of course it underlies the guitar, the piano, and pretty much any pitched stringed instrument. Now, this is also the physical principle that is used in the piano. Now, I'm not going to get into the proper way of describing string vibrations, but I just wanted to mention this point of why strings are so widely used in building instruments. Now, the piano, being a stringed instrument, evolved from its predecessor, which was also a stringed instrument, and which was the harpsichord. And the harpsichord was really the piano of the Baroque era. And it's similar to the piano in many ways. It was every time you hear like one of these Bach pieces, they were originally written for harpsichord, and if you'll just go to YouTube and type in harpsichord music or harpsichord Bach, you'll immediately be able to listen to how this instrument sounds. And I'm sure you'll recognize the sound if you've never heard it before. Now, the harpsichord it looks like a piano, but it actually produces its sound in a different way from a piano. You see, if you look at this, so here on the left you have a harpsichord, just so you can see how it looks like. And if you look here on the right, you see the mechanism of how the sound is produced. So when you push a key on the harpsichord, there's a very fine mechanical element that's attached to the key that ultimately is attached to a plectrum at the end, and this plectrum simply plucks the string. So it's really very similar to the way you produce a sound on a guitar, because on a guitar you pick the string. You have a pick, you have something like this, and you pick the string and you set it into motion. And the harpsichord works in exactly the same way. Well, not exactly, but basically the same way. So oddly enough, the harpsichord, despite again looking like a piano, has more in common with the guitar in some sense than with the piano. And the nice thing about all of this is that you can basically, when you look at this harpsichord has many, many strings. It basically has a string per key. And any key you press, there's a plectrum picking that string. And each string is tuned to a different frequency. And that's how you get your different notes. Now, does this work or not? This works actually pretty well. At the beginning, when harpsichords were sort of being built, people found out that the volume was kind of low. So they found ways around that. For example, they use double strings. Like you have a 12-string guitar, you also have a double-string harpsichord, or sometimes a triple-string harpsichord. And there are many interesting evolutions of the harpsichord itself, which we're not going to get into in this video. And it was a fairly popular instrument, but it had one big problem. And the problem is that you could not control the volume of the plucking with the plectrum through or by the force that you apply in the key. Now, this is a very big point, because when you think about the piano, you almost take it for granted that if you press a key softly, you'll get a soft sound, and if you press it strongly, you'll get a loud sound. But that's not the case for a harpsichord. A harpsichord has a constant volume, and so you have no control over the volume of the plucking of the notes. And this, by the way, is when you hear this Baroque music, it will always have these little embellishments like trills, So these little trills that are very pervasive in Baroque music actually are the result of composers trying to instill emotion into their pieces, because they didn't have any dynamic control. They couldn't control the volume of the playing. So they tried to insert or introduce interest in other ways, or emotion in other ways. So the main problem of the harpsichord was that there was no control over volume. At some point, people tried to work around this. For example, there was a foot control, or actually a knee control, that people kind of could adjust the volume of the notes, not by pressing softly or hardly on the keys, that didn't make a difference, but by adjusting some sort of mechanism with their foot. So it's kind of like a volume pedal on an organ. If you've ever played like a Hammond organ, there's a volume pedal there, and that's how you control the volume on a Hammond organ. And it was kind of similar on the harpsichord. But that wasn't very practical. And this was a big problem. This was something that people wanted they wanted control over the volume of their playing. You know, every player wants to, this is kind of like a basic thing for anyone playing a guitar or a flute or anything. It's obvious that you can control the volume of your notes, but on a harpsichord you can't. So this was a big challenge. Now, at some point, people kind of started thinking about how to solve this, and the first way of solving this, well, a popular way or a popular instrument that sort of crept up alongside the harpsichord was something called the clavichord. And this was like in the 17th century. And the clavichord is also a stringed instrument. It also has a keyboard. You can see a picture of it here. But it produces the sound in a different way. It produces the sound not by plucking the string, but by striking it. And the mechanism is very simple. You see, I'll show you. You have the keys here, and each key is connected to an action, to a mechanism. Basically, when you press the key, and you can see a picture, a sideways picture down below here. So when you press the key in A, let's say this is the key itself, you press it at A, and there's a fulcrum here. See this point right here. So you press it, it goes up, right? It has this point of leverage, and there's something here that strikes a string. The strings here, you can't really see it from the picture, but I'll tell you, the strings actually run sideways. So they run from here all the way to here, say, to the bridge. So you strike the key, it hits the string, which goes like this, and then the string vibrates. Now, it should be obvious that when you do this, if you press it softly, you'll get a soft sound because the hammer, this point here, this pointy thing in the picture, strikes the strings very weakly. And if you press it strongly, it will strike it with more force and you'll get a louder note. So you get control. But the problem is a problem of volume. So there's a problem with this mechanism, actually several problems. And the problems are, well, the main problem is that you don't really get volume. But why don't you get volume? And the reason is that, first of all, you're limited by the amount of force you can apply on the key. So basically the strongest force that you can apply on the string is limited by how strong you can press this. So there's no amplification, no mechanical amplification of your motion. So that's one problem. And the other problem is that when you press the key and you trigger the hammer, which hits the string above it, the hammer stays on the string and it basically dampens it. So you're both exciting the string, but you're also sort of killing the sound that you've created, which is a big problem. And this was a problem that several people wrestled with. And the first guy who found a really good solution to this is this one, this striking fellow here, Cristofori, who was a harpsichord builder. Very smart guy, very smart engineer. And he basically came up with the first modern action, it's called the action, which is the mechanism by which both of these problems were solved. You see, the piano key has these two special things going for it. It strikes, or it produces a sound by triggering a hammer that strikes the string. So in that sense, it's just like the clavichord. But it also does two other things. First of all, it amplifies the motion mechanically. So whatever you press here, the force, the ultimate force that it ends up applying to the string is going to always be larger. So you get more volume. But the really interesting part about the piano is what's called escapement. So escapement refers to the fact that when you push the key, the piano hammer goes up to hit the string, and it sort of gets launched into its trajectory. It hits the string and it goes back. So it hits the string, but it doesn't stay on the string. So the string can keep on vibrating. So there's no dampening of the sound. And these two things are mainly the great innovation that Cristofori came up with. And this is really the foundation or the beginning of the modern piano. And really, if you think about the name piano is actually a shortening of the full name, which is pianoforte. And pianoforte, pianissimo in music means weakly or without any force, and forte means strongly, like with a lot of volume. And the name of the piano was given to it because it can both perform pianissimo and fortissimo passages. So you can control the volume. That's really the great thing about the piano. And today we just call it the piano, but the full name pianoforte indicates indicates basically the new thing about this instrument, its ability to control dynamics. And Cristofori built his first piano in around 1700, and the first piano has been lost. There's no copy of it, but there are 3 pianos left from 1720 that he built. One of them is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You can see there's a picture of it here, which I took from Wikimedia Commons. So if you're in New York and you're visiting the Metropolitan Museum of Art, make sure you make a stop and go take a look at what started the modern revolution of the modern piano. Of course, the modern piano, like if you buy a Steinway today, it's significantly different than the original pianos that Cristofori built. But the basic idea, the heart of the mechanism, the ideas of escapement and the mechanical amplification have stayed, well, not exactly the same, but have stayed at heart very, very similar. And this is kind of the story of the piano, why it had to be invented. It had to be invented because people needed both dynamic control and a lot of volume. And Cristofori basically solved both of these problems simultaneously. So that's our story for today. And, depending on how this series, as this video is received, maybe I'll make additional videos, because I do want to talk about a lot of interesting things about the piano. For example, have you ever thought about why the piano is built with this weird shape? Has this curved kind of shape. So where does that come from? Why are the piano hammers, if you've looked at the piano, they have like this felt on them. They're not hard, they're kind of softish. So why is that? That's an interesting question when you think about it. How do you choose the strings? How do you tune the piano? Why are some of the keys white and other keys are why are the keys arranged the way they are? That's another interesting question that deserves some discussion. Of course, depending on how much of a piano nut you are, maybe these questions are completely boring for you. But just leave a comment and say if you want to see additional videos or not, and depending on the replies, maybe I'll make a few more. That's it. I hope you learned something interesting, and I'll see you next time.